Everybody, I'm Elaine Ikeda with California Campus Compact, and you are participating in a webinar series that we do at California Campus Compact in collaboration with Utah Campus Compact and Campus Compact of the Mountain West. So today's topic is community or political engagement, educating for democracy in troubled times. I am going to go over a little bit of logistics for those of you who may not be familiar with the Zoom platform that you're on. You will be seeing Rick Battistoni's PowerPoint as we go through this. I want to let you know we're recording this webinar, and it will be available after on our YouTube channel, and we will be sending you that link in the next 24 hours or so, when we also send you an evaluation for you to fill out to evaluate this webinar. If you put your cursor down towards the bottom of the screen, you will see some items show up. You've all been muted so that we don't have to hear phones ringing, other conversations. But if you have any questions at all during this presentation, you can type them in the Q&A box that you see down there. If you click on that, you can actually ask a question. And at the end of the webinar, we have allocated time for some Q&A with Rick. And so I will be monitoring that Q&A box, and I will ask Rick the questions that are in there at the end of the webinar. Unfortunately, we aren't able to unmute people as they have their questions, so we'll be using that box. So just move your cursor down to the bottom, click on the Q&A, and we'll be able to see what questions you type in there. Again, thank you for joining us. I want to do a brief introduction of our guest presenter, Rick Battistoni. I have known Rick for a long time, and I thought it'd be fun to just do a Google search and see what came up when I typed in Rick Battistoni. And it turns out that there's a dentist in Oak Park, Illinois, named Rick Battistoni, and the executive director of the Las Vegas Food Services Incorporated is also named Rick Battistoni. I don't know if you knew this, Rick. There's also someone who's a partner in an assurance services group in Winnipeg, which is a mid-size agri-food producer. So anyway, all of those are the other Rick Battistonis out there in the world. But we're thrilled to have Rick join us today for the webinar. He is the professor of political science and of Public and Community Service Studies, and the director of the Feinstein Institute for Public Service at Providence College. He has a long history of being a leader in the field of service learning and civic engagement, and has been a longtime partner and supporter of many Campus Compact initiatives. And he was a leader in the work on the Engaged Department Institutes, which was a strategic initiative of Campus Compacts to embed service learning in various disciplines and support faculty in deepening their practice, while also influencing promotion and tenure within the academy. So I've really enjoyed working with him off and on over the years, and I'm going to turn it over to Rick now. And again, any questions you have, just type them in the Q&A box. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Elaine, and I want to thank Campus Compact for making this opportunity available. I'm excited to be visiting with everyone today and laying out a few thoughts and some questions and some provocations, and hope that we can get some conversation going, some questions at the end. I'm going to talk through some slides that I've put together, and hopefully they'll raise questions for you and allow you to make challenges, critiques, all of those things. But this is something that is near and dear to my heart, has been since I've been involved with Campus Compact. And so, in the current context, raises some new questions. So very excited to get started. And again, thanks, Elaine, for the opportunity. I'm going to I hope leave plenty of time for conversation, but bear with me and I'll get started. Before I get started, I want to make clear my opening assumptions. The first is that I think that politics and political engagement matter. They matter a lot. I'm a political scientist and a democratic theory, so I think as a advocate of democracy with a small d, it matters that people are engaged, but more importantly, it matters that we need all hands on deck. We have problems and issues that require the voices and ideas and creativity of everyone. And when our students, our current and future resources in our society are not engaged, are not thinking about the public sphere and public policy in those issues, we're losing out. We don't have everybody contributing to public problem solving. For our students' own development, it matters because I fully believe that you can't be an effective health professional unless you know the public policy and political context for healthcare reform, all of those issues. You cannot be an effective educator if you don't understand the public policy and political context of education reform and the way that education is dealt with at the local, national, and international level. And so in order to be effective in one's career, in one's vocation, it matters that you understand the public policy context. So politics matters. And the second assumption is that I still, after all these years, believe that community engagement can be, if done well and done intentionally, can be an effective way into politics and political engagement. It's not the only way, it's not the only vehicle, but it is done well, an effective vehicle, and particularly given that a lot of the students that I encounter are so turned off by politics that they wouldn't start there. Starting by looking at questions of service and engagement and partnering with community and involving oneself in community can be a vehicle to get students to think about politics, public life, and participation in politics. The last thing I'll lead with is that I will go back and forth in my use of terminology. I may use service learning, community engagement, education for democracy, civic engagement, not all of those interchangeably, but I've come over the years to decide that while some people care a little too much about what terminology is used and how we highlight it, I may use these interchangeably, and you certainly can challenge that at the end or question it, but I may go back and forth, and I hope that I am understood. All right, so let me get started. I want to also recognize some influences. As I get older and as I think about these questions, I realize all of the people who have influenced me, and we've lost all three of them in this field. Herman's still alive and doing great work, mainly in South Carolina, but for those of you who are new to the field, you may not have been influenced by these folks. Elizabeth Hollander, obviously, former president of Campus Compact. I can still hear her talking about this work as being important because our democracy depends on it. She was a huge believer that this work in community engagement, if it wasn't about political engagement and engagement in creating change in public life, that it wasn't worth doing. My personal mentor, my dissertation advisor, Benjamin Barber, who died last spring, also was a huge influence, particularly during the 1990s when the field moved toward an explicitly civic engagement emphasis. And then Herman Blake, who I have so many phrases that he brought. He was a teacher through some of the early Campus Compact institutes, and a huge influence early on, at least for me. And those are people that if you're new in the field and haven't heard much about them, I would urge you to look them up, and I can give you references as well. All right, so I want to go back and give a sense of what I think the story of engagement in higher education has been. It's a story many of you may know, may tell. You may tell it a little differently than I do, but I think it's important to know where we've come from and where we've been. And I'll try to spend as little time as possible on this. But if we think about the Campus Compact history as part of the story of higher education engagement, and of course it goes back way before Campus Compact, I'll admit that. But when the three presidents and Frank Newman got together and formed Campus Compact in 1985-86, over 30 years ago, their focus was on engaging in community. And it was primarily, the language was around community service. At the time, there was a concern about the so-called me generation, about excessive individualism, and community service was seen as an antidote to that. The student arm of this movement, the Campus Outreach Opportunities League, COOL, also formed about the same time and was an attempt to respond to that as well. It's almost 30 years now that President Edward Blaustein at Rutgers University gave a commencement address in which he argued for community service as a graduation requirement, as a way of defeating the shibboleths or the pathologies of excessive individualism on the one hand, and the persistence of bigotry, discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, religious intolerance, fear of foreigners, class inequalities. That was 1988, and we've come so far since then. It sounds familiar even today. Well, so that's the origin. Very quickly in, however, the language and the emphasis shifted because this is higher education and we are about learning. And so the language of service learning really comes in by the late 1980s. There are conferences, best practice principles that get articulated to combine service with learning, an emphasis on institutionalizing the work. I would say that there's a good decade there, late 80s to the late 90s, where service learning is the coin of the realm, and this effort to mainstream, to make this institutionalized by focusing on the learning outcomes of doing work in communities. Then I think 1996 and beyond, we began to see that all of this, because there were assumptions that all of this work would inevitably lead people into participation in public life, that this would be education for democracy, that people would move from community engagement to political engagement. It just didn't happen. The election of 1996 witnessed the lowest voter turnout in decades. Especially among traditionally aged college students, or people who were of the age of traditionally aged college students. A lot of reports came out talking about the United States as a nation of spectators rather than participants. And there was a great hand-wringing on the part of higher education, and a feeling that we needed to move toward explicitly political engagement as what we needed to be about. And so we see at the beginning of the 21st century calls for increased attention to civic education and engagement, political engagement, some responses in higher education, and I would say after that, frustration and disappointment, because again, it didn't happen. And we're still today thinking and talking about the need to move from community engagement to political engagement, at least some of us are. So I want to say Campus Compact was one of the leading organizations trying to do this, in large part it was in response to what we were hearing. I have a couple of quick quotes from students. they are not necessarily in this time frame, but they represent what was going on and why we were frustrated. So we have this quote that represents that students are not interested in politics. They'd rather go help a kid read than be concerned about political engagement. And then there's this classic quote I've stolen from Bernadette Shee, and Elaine knows the story, of the senior who talked about wanting children and grandchildren to work in homeless shelters. And Bernadette asked, what is wrong with this picture? Yes. And from college presidents, Derek Bach, leaving Harvard University as president, had this classic tidbit here. So in part in response to this, we get Campus Compact producing the President's Declaration on the Civic Responsibility of Higher Education. Again, Liz Hollander, Harry Boyd were key figures in drafting this. 400 or 500 college presidents signed on very quickly. And you see Campus Compact decided that, yes, we need to renew our role as agents of democracy, and a recognition that service by itself is not necessarily leading students to embrace the duties of active citizenship and civic participation. With this, I think we begin to see a change in language. Many centers and units in campuses that were either community service centers or service learning centers began to change their names, or at least see civic engagement as a primary goal. And for a decade, at least, there was this effort to move in the direction of political and civic engagement. However, over that decade, a number of publications suggested that we weren't moving the needle, beginning with, at the K-12 level, the Civic Mission of Schools, a publication that still, I think, rings true in terms of what the K-12 schools are doing or not doing. In fact, probably rings more true than it did in 2003. In 2007, the Kettering Foundation and the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement Circle produced a nice little volume called Millennials Talk Politics. It was actually a redo of something Kettering had done in the 1990s, a really nice volume worth looking at. But again, suggesting that universities, when they were providing levels of opportunity for civic participation learning, it was unequal and uneven. The same year, the fruition of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching's political engagement project produced a volume that Ann Colby and Liz Beaumont and Tom Ehrlich produced, a really great piece suggesting that we're not paying enough attention in higher education to political engagement outcomes. And then finally, all this culminates in 2012 with a crucible moment. Hard to believe that that's 6 years ago. But crucible moment recognized that, that we're not really achieving what we want to achieve because maybe the academy is not well positioned to produce a civic engagement agenda. So these documents all suggest that we're not moving the needle. So I want to look at where we are today and raise the questions for today. As a political scientist, I start with electoral participation. A lot of people would challenge that and suggest that, that voting is not a good measure of political engagement, but I think the fact remains that it is the lowest common denominator form of engagement. If you're not voting, you're not likely to be engaged in other forms of that we might call political engagement or policy work or advocacy work. So in 2016, depending on how you count the voting eligible population, about 60% of those eligible to vote voted. That's more than voted in 2012, but less than 2008. We've been hovering around this high 50% range for some time now. And now we have the benefit of the INSELV college student voting rate results, the work of Nancy Thomas at the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education at Tufts University. A lot of schools now have joined this national study, and we can actually see how our college student voting rates look nationally as well as on your own campus. And if you haven't joined, if your institution hasn't joined, I really urge you to do that. It's free. You get some great data, and as well as a lot of other resources. So in 2012, which is the first year that INSELV really measured this, and this is students in college, the overall rate was 47%. 2 years later, in an off-year election, which where participation tends to be a lot lower, particularly among college students, a paltry 19%. And then in 2016, the voting rate went up, but since voter registration rates were also up, the actual voting rate of registered students, I would argue, was down, and not a robust electoral participation. If we look at broader questions of our political system, you all know about the complaints about partisan polarization. I've just anecdotally heard students really dissatisfied in a way that I haven't heard before with our two-party system, with politics as it's practiced, especially at the national level. We've got the persistence of inequity and discrimination, inequality, and at the same time a backlash against efforts to address inequities and efforts to increase inclusion and diversity. I am really struck by this issue of how we know what we know about politics. The segmentation of our political information, the fact that people are only listening and viewing information that aligns with their own viewpoints, the arguments about whether news is fake and whether our facts are really facts is really disturbing. And for citizens and our students, how they know what they know about politics matters. This has led Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein in a recently published book with E.J. Dionne to argue that we are facing the greatest crisis in our democracy since the Civil War. That's pretty disturbing. Last month, the Chronicle of Higher Education had a little section, I think they called it Civics 101, and they talked about what's going on college campuses. The same Nancy Thomas that I referenced earlier was quoted as saying that, you know, we may end up on the wrong side of history, and that we really are not producing the kind of political education that our campuses need to produce. And that leads to two questions that the Chronicle raised. Should we be offering more than service learning opportunities to get students politically involved? I think that's a rhetorical question. But the bigger question is, can this work in community engagement and service learning on its own, even intentionally done, well done, create socially and politically aware students? Well, let's see if we can answer that question. A few years ago, I wrote a piece in the Higher Education Exchange, a publication of the Kettering Foundation, and I suggested that a lot of the disappointment with our field has to do with three problems that are endemic to the field. First of all, I think that one of the problems with our field is that we don't really pay attention to the democratic purposes of engagement work. Most programs that I see on college campuses tend to be very thin in their conceptual notions of engagement and democracy. So one of the answers as to why we're not doing better and moving the needle in the area of civic engagement or political engagement is that our programs just don't have that as their primary aim. part of what has happened with institutionalization is in trying to build community engagement on our campuses and trying to connect it to the curriculum, we've wanted to invite everybody in. We want to do engagement across the curriculum. And it's not an easy thing to connect that to political engagement. As a political scientist, that matters to me, but a lot of my political science colleagues don't think that civic engagement or political engagement is what they want to do. They want to do the science of politics. And so you can imagine that a biologist or an engineer or someone in business administration or the visual or performing arts or in foreign language studies, that to ask someone to do engagement work in the first place, to do partnership work with communities, is a big enough stretch as it is. But then to ask them to connect that to democratic purposes, to notions about civic education, of citizens in a democracy, is something that many faculty and others on our campuses, other educators, just aren't equipped to do, aren't inclined to do. It doesn't tie to their own notion of themselves as teachers or scholars. And so as a result, most of our programs end up being quite thin in how they've conceptualized civic engagement, democracy, how they connect community engagement with those notions, if they do at all. There's a weak theories of change. If we're using logic models, one of the impact areas is not seen as education for democracy. So we have a problem of purpose. We also have a problem of time. Most higher education interventions, if you will, or programs operate at best as one time, one semester, one course interventions. To the extent that, again, we've tried to institutionalize and do civic engagement across the curriculum, this is often done, at least from the student's point of view, as one course. It may be a course that is in the major, often not. It may be a course in the first year as part of a first year seminar program. It's just hard to develop civic capacities, to develop civic knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes in a one course, one semester time frame. We may, in the United States, the 14th Amendment guarantees that people born in the United States are born citizens, and you can legally, but you don't become an effective citizen by birth. You don't become an effective citizen by a one and done course. Even the best designed courses in higher education are not going to be able to develop the kinds of skills and values and knowledge base and the ability to confront the kinds of public problems that citizens need to confront. And this is especially true when that civic intervention is done not connected to a student's major or career aspirations. If I'm studying management and I'm taking a course, maybe my first year, or a course that's a general education course that has a community engagement component, even designed toward civic education, if I don't see it connected to my career aspirations, to my identity as a manager or an engineer or whatever it is I see as my primary identity, I think it's hard to connect one's citizenship to what one sees as future work or whatever identity you want to maintain. So there's a problem of time. And I think it's a serious problem, and it's hard to overcome because of the way we've structured our work and tried to institutionalize it. And then finally, I think we have a problem of what I call a problem of accountability. At the one hand, we're not really thinking about what our graduates should be prepared to do concerning their civic identities and civic skills. And then we don't do a very good job of thinking about how we evaluate it. We do a good job of counting We can count the number of hours served, and we can even translate that into dollars, which our institutions love to see, because then they can say what their contribution to the community has been through student service learning or community engagement work. There are a lot of pre-post surveys that are done, but we really don't think about what happens at the end of a college career and then beyond. We don't really think longitudinally whether our programs are really achieving what we hope to achieve with respect to education for citizenship 5 years after a student has graduated, 10 years, 15, 20. And that's really hard to do, but we're not really doing it very well. All right, so how do we deal with these problems? I think we can address these problems. First, we have to address the problem of purpose by articulating core outcomes. One of the things that a Crucible moment did was it came up with a framework for 21st century citizenship. The framework is exhaustive and a little bit ambitious, but it provides a framework of what we're talking about when we're thinking about knowledge and attitudes and skills that citizens in a democracy, and a diverse, pluralistic democracy, need to have. Whatever we do, we need to articulate what our core outcomes are with respect to political and civic engagement. We need to think about time differently as well. I think we need to think about sustained developmental programs. And there's been an emergence of minors, certificates, an effort to do civic learning in the major or create engaged departments. The AAC&U's peer review has a new issue out about civic learning in the major with some case examples of what's going on in different programs around the country, which I'd recommend to all of you. But however we do it, we need to think about this problem of time and think about how we can build upon courses and co-curricular efforts to build a sustainable developmental program so that one's civic identity matters and it's connected to other identities that our students have. And then finally, I think we need to do more longitudinally. One of the things I'm very proud of is that our own program here at Providence College, which is a interdisciplinary major and minor in public and community service studies, we have looked at our graduates in combination with a couple of other programs that, like ours, is sustained and developmental. And we've generated data through both quantitative and qualitative data, and I'll talk about this briefly at the end of this presentation to give you a sense of what we found. But we need to do more of that, and we need to share and disseminate what we're learning across the field. So the question is, are there signs of hope? Some would say, given what I've just presented, maybe we should give up on community engagement, as maybe it's not even a vehicle, let alone the most effective vehicle to move us toward political engagement. One of the things I just saw in this AAC&U publication was a reference to the President's Commission on Higher Education some 70 years ago. And you'll see that 70 years ago, this presidential commission was arguing that, that the first thing that higher education ought to do is be the carrier of democratic values, ideals, and process. And it has 3 goals related to this. And to think about this as a charge for higher education 70 years ago is a little bit depressing that we have not moved the needle in 70 years, let alone 30 years since Campus Compact's been doing this work. But I would say that we can't abandon hope. I still am hopeful, and there's some reasons for that. First of all, I think that there are things that service learning, that are at the foundation of service learning or community engagement, that are also at the foundation of good democratic political education. I do hold out hope because community engagement, flips this expert knower relationship that we have in higher education, that it is both the community and the student who is having the experience in the community who becomes the expert, and allows for a much more democratic pedagogy and epistemology. I believe that Tania Mitchell is absolutely right when she talks about critical service learning and that 2008 Michigan Journal article, that service learning done critically and well redistributes power, not only between higher education and the communities that we work with, but also in the classroom between teacher and student. That has democratic implications, so I don't want to give up hope because of that. Secondly, I think that community engagement creates authentic relationships, and in a democracy, especially at the local level, as I quote David Matthews, I think we define ourselves by what we do with other citizens, what we do with other individuals in our community. And that service learning and community engagement shares this sentiment that it is interacting between people and understanding how people formulate problems, identify problems, and begin to move towards solutions. That both community engagement and participatory democratic activity share. I believe very strongly that critical reflection and eloquent listening ought to be both part of community engagement, and they're essential parts of good democratic civic education. The term eloquent listening is something that I first heard Herman Blake use, referencing a phrase in Langston Hughes' Simple series, Jesse Simple series. And I think that we talk about deliberation a lot, but part of the power of deliberative dialogue is the power that comes from listening to one another. And in our engagement work, we need to be listening not only to students, but to our community partners and to the populations that we serve in our communities. Then finally, I think that there's that we have theoretical foundations in pragmatism, not only in John Dewey, but other of the pragmatists that are both connected to service learning and to democratic theory and practice. So for those reasons, as well as others, I don't think we should give up hope. Campus Compact entered the fray once again about a year and a half ago when it issued an action statement. I think the action statement is eloquent. It focuses on these questions around democracy and revitalizing our democracy and revitalizing political engagement. Not only that, I think not only does the Compact want us to focus on these action statements related to political engagement, but those presidents who have signed the statement are committing their campuses to an action plan and a process of developing a plan of action to move toward the goals stated in the anniversary action statement. And so I have some hope around that. I've seen some of the action statements that universities have come up with, and they're ambitious and strong. Whether we realize those or not, I think that's really a sign of hope. I'm also hopeful because of what's going on across the Atlantic Ocean. You may have heard that the Oxford English Dictionary chose for its word of the year of 2017 the word youthquake, which I hadn't even heard that term used. But it comes out of the significant increase that occurred in the summer 2017 general election in the United Kingdom. For years, youth engagement in politics in the UK had been going the direction that it had in the United States. And there was a significant increase, a huge increase, unexpected increase. And that offers signs of hope, if only because there were candidates that were speaking to the concerns and the goals and ambitions of young people. And maybe we can see some hope if that happens in this country. Then finally, I think there's signs of hope that come out of this study that I told you about, that we did, the 3-institution study of the graduates of sustained developmental programs on 3 campuses, Stanford, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and Providence College. First of all, we, through our quantitative survey that we did in 2012, we had some fairly robust voting rates among the graduates, all self-reported, no doubt, but still robust. So the fact that these programs that had civic engagement outcomes, political engagement outcomes as part of the goals of the programs, and that graduates 5 and 10 and 15 years after they graduated were reporting very high levels of at least electoral participation is something. We also asked a question with a number of about 21 different items, asking these graduates whether in the past year they had done the following: discuss political issues with friends, volunteered, boycotted or boycotted products, and you can see the different things, even confronted joke statements or innuendos that did a service to a particular population. And again, we saw fairly robust rates of action in these areas as well. In addition to the quantitative survey, which has a mountain of data that we developed out of it, we did interviews with a stratified random sample from each of the programs. And then we followed up after we had done the interviews and done a preliminary analysis and did focus groups with graduates from the 3 institutions to ask them to help us interpret the data. And we learned a lot in these interviews and focus groups about what civic and political identity looks like and what the barriers might be to fairly recent graduates to participating in the communities of which they found themselves a part. What we found was that these graduates spoke a lot about local participation, that they weren't focused as much on national politics, on presidential campaigns, but more focused on local action. And the local action took so many different forms when we talked to graduates. They talked about civic action and politics in the workplace, how they could do things that would advance the solving of problems in the workplace, and saw the potential for civic action where they were working, whether it was in a hospital or a school or in interaction with their workmates. We also heard really powerful articulation of the role that critical reflection, which was a key component of all of these programs, how that played out in their lives after they graduated, and how that connected to understandings of themselves as civic actors, as citizens. And so it kind of reinforced what those of us who were part of this study thought about the role of critical reflection in civic and political identity and engagement. And then finally, and I'm borrowing a term that I got from Rowdy Hildreth and his colleagues when Rowdy was at the University of Minnesota doing a study of various youth work, that civic action was in many of these graduates a way of life for the alums of these 3 programs. I like the term civic vocation, the idea that for these graduates, they felt called by a problem in the public realm, by a crisis in the public realm, to act in the same way that we think about a religious calling in the kind of historical or traditional sense. And I've lifted a quote from Jim Wallace's baccalaureate address from Stanford University, something that I've often used with seniors as well, that there was a powerful sense that that is important to think about making a difference in the world, and that the world's problems can call us to act in particular ways. And we saw this in our graduates. And in all of that, I think there is hope in what are arguably very difficult times. Just as a personal note, before I close and ask for questions, right after the 2016 election, a few of us here at the Feinstein Institute received a note from a graduate who had been out for a few years from having graduated, and she reported that that while there may have been reason for despair after the election, she felt that the education that she'd been provided gave her the tools to continue to try to make a difference and make change, that she had tools around organizing, around identifying problems, around working with others from diverse backgrounds and with diverse ideas. And she told us, don't despair, keep teaching, and teaching hard, and teach like hell, she said, because it matters. And these tools are things that we can carry with us, even in times of despair. So I still have hope. I am somewhat cynical from time to time, but I have hope, and hope all of you do too. And want to thank everyone for listening, and see if there are questions or comments or challenges or critiques that people want to take up.
Thanks so much, Rick. That was really great. We do have a few questions that have come in, a couple logistical ones. There's some folks who really liked some of the quotes you had, and they wanted to know if you would be willing to share your PowerPoint.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So after this, you can email your latest version to Piper, and when we send out the eval and the link to YouTube, I did say that people can watch this video. It's recorded, so they can also look at it again that way. The other question, sort of logistical, is would you also, is that study that you guys did, is that something that's been published? Is it, how can people find that study and its results?
There are pieces that have been published, and probably the most prominent of which is a 2015 Michigan Journal article that really specifically looked at the role of reflection after college. And again, it's Colleen Raspanek, Tania Mitchell, and myself, and a couple of other contributors that wrote this piece. So it wasn't, I'm not by far not the only person involved. Colleen and Tania are doing ongoing work, and we're hoping that some things will be published out of it in the future. Tania and I are writing a piece for Diversity and Democracy that is part of an issue that's going to look at what happens to alums after graduation in programs and at colleges and universities that really care about civic action and engagement. And so that's probably going to be coming out sometime this year as well. But I can send a copy of a PDF that comes out of the Michigan Journal piece if people are interested.
Yeah, that would be great. If you can also, send some of those links to Piper. Someone is asking if they could replicate the study.
I don't see why not. I think we can. I need to talk to Tania and Colleen in particular and see. I don't think there's anything proprietary, but yeah, absolutely. And I think we want to encourage not just replication, but people can look at the instruments and the interview protocols and focus group protocols we used and adapt them to their own purposes. Yeah, I think the survey we used is probably way too long for most people. The interview protocol, these interviews were on average an hour each, and people might want to shorten those down. But I think that this is the kind of field that we need to be stealing from each other and being resources to each other. So I'll check in with the two of them, but I don't see why that our tools couldn't be used.
Okay, great. And you are providing your email address here so people can email you directly if they're interested in that.
Back in touch with you if you want to ask any questions, about any of that stuff.
Okay, so I'll move on to a few other questions, and a reminder to folks, if you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A box. I will get to the chats in a second, and Rowdy has a couple questions, but I'm going to start first in order of folks asking. A couple of these questions came in pretty early in your presentation. Zara from UC Irvine asked, what are your thoughts regarding how we define political engagement and the pros and cons of defining it more broadly? I'm curious about the ways that youth and others attempt to engage the political system outside of the more traditional forms, which include campaign contributions, voting, writing letters, etc.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's a really important point. I think that younger generations who tend to define political engagement in different ways, that we need to listen to them. I think that we need to listen to voices of young people about how they're defining their engagement in politics, in public life, and that ought to go into how we think about what our outcomes ought to be for our students. So I think that, I don't know that broadly is the right term, but I think we need to define what we mean by engagement simply, but in a way that can be useful given the way that particularly younger people see engagement in our public life, so that it isn't just defined or even primarily defined around particular acts like voting or writing or working in a campaign or things like that. I think that we ought to be thinking about certain skill sets that are important to participating in a democracy. There's certain ways of thinking about knowledge. I think that that issues of voice and listening and reflection, critical reflection, are important as part of a liberal education as well as part of a democratic education. One of the problems I had with a Crucible Moment is that there were just too many things in that list, and I think there were 31 elements of their framework for 21st century civic learning, and to think that we can try to achieve all of those or even a part of those. But I think that if it helps if we can come to some kind of agreement about what those baseline things ought to be and begin to think about how do we operationalize those and how do we put those into our programs as goals and outcomes. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
So this is from Rowdy at CU Boulder, who you mentioned in the study. Yeah, he's saying hello to you too. There's a couple questions. I'm going to go with the one he asked first. I too have heard anecdotal stories of alienation from the two-party system. I also have seen incredible energy among students towards engagement. Do you have any sense of recent studies that can make sense of this twofold phenomena of alienation and activism?
That's a great question. Well, that's why I wanted to reference the UK, because what I saw in what happened was that when you had at least one candidate who was addressing issues that mattered to young people and addressing issues kind of outside the mainstream of the party system in the UK, young people responded because I think Jeremy Corbyn was, for whatever we think about his ideology, he was addressing issues that mattered to young people around higher education, affordability and accessibility, as well as issues of inequality that mattered to young people. And I think that Jim Hightower, who used to be an elected official in Texas, said if the gods wanted us to vote, they would have given us candidates. And part of the problem with our political system is that our candidates and our campaigns are aimed at people who vote, who tend to be older, and they're really not addressing the things that young people care about. And young people want to make a difference. They have things that concern them, a whole range of things, and our campaigns and our two parties really aren't addressing those issues. And when they do, I think young people and a lot of citizens respond. And that's what's so frustrating. So that, I don't know if that explains the twofold nature of it, but I'm seeing on this campus, a lot of students get very involved in achieving change on campus. They see things that are wrong on campus they want to address, and they want to have a voice in those things, and they are quite activists around issues, whether it be racial equity or housing housing and voice in housing issues on campus. And so I think a lot of it's a matter of having a public that responds to what people care about and having an avenue for what people care about to be addressed in the public realm. And I think our two-party system just isn't doing that, at least for the aged students, the traditionally aged college students that I see.
Okay. The other question from Rowdy, let's see, okay, so you talked about the challenge of time. You mentioned majors, minors, and certificate programs as possible avenues to address the question from the perspective of students. He'd like to think about this question from the perspective of community partners. So I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, and I think that goes hand in hand. I think that if you have something that's more sustainable over time, it is more likely that students who are working with a partner over time or working on an issue that doesn't, part of the problem of time is that community problems aren't aren't addressed in a semester. They they span a longer period of time. And so if there are ways that we can think about our curricula and our co-curriculum in ways that students can get involved and continue to be involved and to be involved at a higher level as they go through over time, it is more likely that the relationships are going to develop with community partners and the kind of mutuality and reciprocity that can only develop over time. And after all, a lot of our community partners distrust the involvement of us as institutions and our students. And that trust can only be built over time, that if we have that kind of over the course of several terms or semesters or years, it is more likely that students are going to learn from the wisdom of our communities. They're going to develop relationships. They're going to have mentors in the community, as well as actually be a resource to communities in trying to tackle the problems that our communities are concerned about, and therefore we ought to be concerned about. I'm struck by the fact that we have a lot of students who go through the 4 years of our major and minor who aren't from Providence, and they stay here because they've developed relationships, they develop networks, they develop references, and they continue to work, and they're compelled by the kind of work that they get to do. But that only happens over time. So I think from the perspective of partnerships, that time is even more important.
Okay, great, thanks. A few more questions have come in. I think we'll probably take these last 3 or 4 and then stop at that, since we only have about 10 or so more minutes. Do you have any suggestions? This is from Monique Ellison. Do you have any suggestions on how to help students and campuses move from focusing solely on volunteering to focusing on political engagement?
Well,
big question. It's kind of a long question.
It's a big question. Well, I think that really has to do with how we think intentionally about the whatever toolbox we have on our campus, and that differs from campus to campus. So if we're talking about incorporating community engagement into the curriculum, I think we can think about the ways in which the curriculum can be a way to harvest work in communities, relationships that are developed through service or volunteering that can then allow students to think about root causes, the root causes and the public policy issues that lead to the need for service and volunteering in the first place, can develop ways that students can, I don't want to say convert, but how volunteering and volunteer work in the community can be vehicles to thinking about public problems, public problem solving, and think about the more overt political issues that arise out of the relationships that are being developed, the problems that are being addressed. So that's the way I would answer it. And I think there are a lot of different tools that can be used. There are additional resources and materials that can be used in a classroom. If the course is tied to particular disciplinary departments, there are disciplinary lenses that can have more overtly political ways of thinking about things, or ways that a person within a discipline can approach questions of civic education and democracy and politics. So I think it's a matter of bringing what we can bring as educators to bear on the experience of volunteering or doing community service or doing community-based research, whatever form that community experience takes, and thinking intentionally about how we transform that experience into learning about public life and politics. And that, I think, can have many forms depending on where you are, what your institution allows, and who you're working with.
Great. Okay. Last few questions. You have a quote about how we're so worried about appearing partisan. Findings in my field do tend to support more progressive policies, but they come from rigorous research. How do I keep students from shutting down when I introduce ideas that may challenge how they see the world, particularly in this time of heightened political conflict?
That's a great question. And I think that's a question all of us have to pay attention to. I think that this whole field has been concerned about how it's perceived as being perceived as more progressive, as more left-leaning. And I think one answer to that is to say that the kinds of research and the kinds of scholarly work that we can bring to bear on working communities will make a student more effective regardless of what ideological bent they have and what their approach is to a particular problem. And that I think that wherever students want to end up, that they're going to be more effective if they learn the skills and the knowledge base and the tools that they need to confront the problems that they care about. We have a course in community organizing that we offer, and when it was first put forth as a permanent course, the dean of our college asked if, oh, this is a leftist course, is it not? And my argument was that the tools of organizing can be used by people who are on the right or the left, and it makes a person a more effective citizen. And so if our education for democracy is aimed at skill bases, at critical thinking, at the development of knowledge bases that can be used by whoever wants to use them, that we can be more multi-partisan, if you will, not necessarily nonpartisan. So that's one answer. I think the other answer is that this work around political engagement is inevitably going to be accused of being on the left, because ultimately democracy is about being on the side of the people. And the work that we're doing in communities is to address issues that have not been addressed by the political system. And so I think we have a tradition that puts us on a particular side, and I think we have to be honest about it. I don't know that will solve the problem of students shutting down, but I think we have to be honest about what side we're on. And ultimately, if we bring more younger people out to vote, we know what that may mean in terms of political outcomes. But I do think that we can make an argument that this will make citizens more effective regardless of where they want to be and what their ideologies are, what their identities are, and what goals they want to pursue.
Last two questions. This one is relating back to the research study. How do we support faculty in conducting this kind of research with their alumni?
I think providing it takes a lot, and it requires resources to be able to do this work. First of all, you have to have an institution that's committed to maintaining contact with alums. One of the first things we had to do, and it took us about a year, maybe even more than a year, was make sure that we had a solid list of contact information for all of our alums who are part of these programs. And if you want to do a comparison group, you have to be able to come up with a control group or comparison group. You have to have an institution that's committed to maintaining contact with alums. So that's one thing. I think that providing resources that faculty might need to conduct this research, whether it be resources to produce surveys to help analyze and enter data, to help with transcription and the like, all of the kind of resources you need to be able to do this work, to develop the data, and then to analyze it. That's the role of administrators and other units. And I think the other thing is that it has to be rewarded. If faculty do this research and they do it rigorously, they have to understand that they won't be punished, at least, by doing this kind of research rather than research that may be seen as more appropriate to their disciplinary department. So research on the scholarship of teaching and learning has to be valued by the institution that you're at. And if it isn't, it's hard to convince faculty and other scholars to do the work. Fortunately, that is valued at my institution, but a lot of institutions, colleagues can be discouraged if they're probationary or if they are looking to be tenured or promoted, and it's not valued by their departments or by the college or university as a whole. So I think those are the ways in which we can support it. And I think, and sharing information about this work being done on different campuses. So our interest in sharing what we've done and how we've done it, hopefully could be a resource to other people on other campuses.
Great. Okay, so this is our last question. It has a little bit of a long lead up because it has a little bit of comments tied in. So Jeremy says, thank you for your presentation. I agree with much of it. A couple of things. I think tenure and promotion guidelines are key, despite the legitimate critique re the downside of institutionalization. If civic learning is recognized there, it incentivizes faculty to design a deeper civic pedagogy. Second, living learning communities is another high impact practice that, if it connects courses and service learning projects over multiple semesters, has great potential. Third, and this I think gets to the question, third, a more macro point, we need to get organized at all levels to fight voter suppression and gerrymandering, and also push for more voting by mail or making Election Day a national holiday. We have tremendous structural barriers for all citizens, regardless of age. For me, part of college students' low voter participation relates to these barriers. So the question is, what specific ways do you see for higher ed to intervene and gain leverage to remove these state and nationwide structural barriers to voting?
Well, you know, I'd like to hope that that our expertise in higher ed, that our scholarship and our research work can demonstrate that these methods of suppression, that the things that are barriers to registration, to participation in public life, that we need to remove them, and that we can be a voice for that calls for that removal. I know that there are more and more folks in the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit sector that are working on advocating for this. I think that higher education should advocate on behalf of our students that there ought to be, for example, easier ways for our students to register to vote and to vote in the places that they want, whether that's in their home location or on campus, There are a lot of efforts to suppress student vote that really we ought to be advocating against. And so I think that we can lend our voice to the extent that we have that kind of intellectual power toward trying to dismantle all of these ways in which our participation and the participation of our students is being prevented, or where there are barriers and obstacles to that. So I agree completely, and I think that we ought to be a voice for that. We ought to advocate for that, and I think that there might be consequences, but I think we ought to be doing that. That's part of our service, actually, and ought to be recognized as such.
Great,
thank you. I just say one other thing about promotion and tenure. I think there's been some movement on that. Imagining America several years ago has done great work in this area of trying to articulate ways in which engagement in teaching and in scholarship as well as in service can be recognized, can be built into tenure and promotion guidelines. And I think there's been some movement across the nation, not as much as I would like, but there's been movement and people recognizing that this is important. And I think we're seeing a lot of younger scholars who want to do this work, and they're pushing institutions to recognize it because they want to do it. And they're not willing to abide by the old rules of the game until they get tenure, until they get to be full professors. They want to do it now, and they want to be recognized for it because it's legitimate scholarship, it's legitimate pedagogy, and ought to be recognized. So I'm really hopeful that younger scholars are pushing this, and they're pushing the envelope in ways that I hope our institutions respond to.
Well, and as the faculty slowly retire, this new generation of faculty are rising into the full tenured, and they're on the committees and whatnot so we'll see that.
Yeah, hopefully change will occur. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. And thank you to all the participants who are on. It was a wonderful webinar. Rick, we'll close down the webinar and stop the recording, but if you can stay on, Rick, for just a minute. But thank you all. As I said, you'll get an evaluation, and we'll have Rick's PowerPoint and the evaluation and the link to the YouTube channel coming out to you in the next couple days, so watch for an email on that.
Bye, everyone.